I will now like to hand you over to one of our first speakers who's going to give us an opening address. Dr. Tim Stone needs no introduction. He's the chair of the NIA and the Nuclear Risk Insurers, has an illustrious career, and has got some very innovative thoughts to share with you today. So that gives me nothing else to say other than to pass you on to Tim. Thank you.
Super. Thank you very much, Jazz, and thank you very much for inviting me here to speak this morning. As Jazz said, the NIA, NRI roles, I'm also on the board of ARUP. I'm lucky enough to be a visiting prof both at UCL and at Bristol. And to sum it up, I do things I'm interested in with people I like, and I am extremely lucky. But I want to talk to you today about the risk and safety challenges in getting to net zero, in supporting the transition, because the scale of what we have to do is just breathtaking. So rather than doing lots of slides, I'm going to do it a slightly different way this morning. So I'm going to talk about four things within this, about the energy system, about economics, about nuclear, and about markets. And my background includes spending quite a lot of time as a banker doing big projects, financing big projects, assets, trains, all sorts of things like that. But I'm going to start with the energy system, if I may. And I want to start with setting a context, because what we're about to do in terms of trying to get towards net zero and the sixth carbon budget on the way past is whopping. It's absolutely colossal. You've all of you seen in the media recently, and our politicians are embattled by issues like security of supply and resilience. And the penny's beginning to drop that you can't outsource those. Those are things that you have to look after. And when we come to the sheer scale of this challenge, it's breathtaking. Makes the Second World War look basically like a walk in the park. So if you bear with me a second, let's just have a look. Here we are. So this is there's a chap called Grant Chalmers, you can see on the bottom right. And Grant puts these plots out on Twitter on a fairly regular basis. But it's looking at the carbon intensity of electricity consumption. In this case, it's the last 20 days. Look at that scale. Look at the range of where we are. The grey column is where we need to be in the UK by 2030. We are just over halfway down, and the little asterisks show you the average amount of CO2 emitted per unit of electricity, and you can see the range of just how far that goes. And look at places down the bottom like Poland and Queensland and Ireland. Ireland's got a lot of renewables. Interesting. Where's Germany? That's worse than we are. They've got a lot of renewables too. But there's a huge shift to go, an absolutely enormous move to make if we're going to get to that grey zone, and then beyond that for 2050. So for the system as a whole, we've got to think about what is the objective function? What is it we're trying to do? Because it's not just about pounds per megawatt hour anymore. This is a massive rebuild of the system. And what do I mean by the scale of that? So at the moment in the UK, 18% of our energy comes from electricity, 82% from gas and petroleum liquids. That 18% that's electricity, about half of it's decarbonised. And so you might be tempted to think, job half done. No, it's not. Because in that 18%, there's only really Sizewell B within there, with its life extension when it gets it, that'll still be operating post 2050. Everything has to be rebuilt. Think about that. Just imagine the scale of the electricity sector and rebuilding all that generation. But in the words of those late night TV commercials, but wait, there's more. Because you've got to do more than 4 times that again to replace all that gas and all that fossil. That is just whopping. Just whopping. And we add to that now the word system. So if we think back to the electricity system we have now, that was really designed after the war to shift power from coal fields to manufacturing centres, neither of which we have anymore. So it's a massive system rebuild. And the word system, to many of you on this call, you're engineers. You know what the word system means. You know what feedback is. You know what interdependence is. You know what Nyquist diagrams are and Lyapunov stability criteria and stuff like that. But most people don't. Most people think that these things are linear, they're separable. And that you can plug and play bits and pieces and it will carry on. Well, it won't. Not like this. So the sheer scale of this is just breathtaking. And part of what you, the audience, as engineers can help do is to spread the word as to what the word system actually means and its consequences. Because what we're doing at the moment is we're redefining the economic future of our grandchildren, because we're redefining the energy competitiveness of the UK for those grandchildren. And if we get it wrong, our grandchildren won't live here. They'll go somewhere else where it's more sensible. So there's a bit of starter on the energy system. That is all about risk. That's all about risk. So let's now move across here to economics, because you hear all the fuss about gas hitting 405p a therm on the other day, and then the astonishing numbers they've reached. But let's just look some of this through. This national economic competitiveness point is what really matters. As we redesign the system, we have to focus on that. And in that competitiveness, the cost of capital is a real killer number. Let me just show you a graph. And this graph comes from, all being well when I open it, comes from the Cambridge economist, David Newbury. And what he's done is he's looked here at the cost of capital on the bottom and the electricity price down the left-hand side. And for those of you who, so I'm an ex-banker, but cost of capital is just the weighted average cost of all the financing that goes behind a big project. And if you look at that orange line, which is at the bottom on the left, that drops at an amazing rate. It is a very powerful driver. So if you look at the numbers around 8 or 9%, those are the sorts of numbers on a regulated asset base financing that you'd have for project finance rates. Sorry, those sort of numbers, 8 to 9%, that's a project finance rate. But if you get down to a regulated asset base approach, which is how we finance our water and transmission and distribution, it's down the left-hand side. And look at where that orange line is. The cost of capital is the biggest determinant of electricity cost from nuclear compared to all the others. And you can see there that those numbers are below the cost of renewables. And that's not me, that's not a trade body, that's not some booster for nuclear. That's David Newbury, who's a very respected energy economist from Cambridge. So that's the scale of the power of cost of capital and why nuclear, in a few minutes you'll see, becomes so important. But we have to be honest about this. The cost of intermittency is missing in the public and political debate. People don't talk about it. The assumption is that the renewables are just there, and this is not knocking renewables, because as you'll see in a minute, we need the whole shooting match. But we have to be honest about the cost of the system as a whole, and it's clear, both from David's work and understanding the cost of intermittency, that nuclear really can be competitive. So moving down, what really matters now, if we're going to get to net zero, is gigawatts a year within a price limit. It's not trying to micro optimize pounds per megawatt hour. You don't have time to do that. Anything that we have now that we know works, that's low carbon, you've just got to build like there's no tomorrow, because there is no tomorrow unless we build like that. We have to think about how this all fits in the economic system. So what is the role of the regulator? Now, we've got a very efficient regulator who historically has been very good at driving down the cost of energy to consumers. That's their duty as part of regulators. They have to drive down the cost to consumer over a 5-year period. That's not what we're doing now. This is about redesigning the system, and how do we do this in terms of reducing the cost to the national economy for the next 40, 50, 60 years, because that's the timescale that flows from the consequences of the decisions that we're taking now. In rebuilding this system, we are going to have the most astonishing investment and jobs opportunities, because all those assets have to be replaced, rebuilt in different places. And from an investment point of view, infrastructure funds, pensions funds, insurance companies, these are really long-dated, high-quality, low-risk returns. And to go with this, the number of jobs that will be needed is off-scale. And to get a scale of just what I'm talking about there, when Sizewell B was being built, the jobs map for the UK had only one constituency in the northwest of Northern Ireland, which didn't have jobs flowing from Sizewell B. That's just one big reactor. Just think what happens as we go to more big reactors, gigawatt scale, SMRs and AMRs. So that's enough for the minute on economics. I want to talk a bit now about nuclear itself. And let's talk about where it fits. And it is the foundation of a rational energy system. It's the bit on which other bits are built. It's the bit that is there 24/7, which is really reliable. And if you remember my graph earlier on, in terms of cost per megawatt hour, with properly financed, it's cheap. But to get there, we have to scale up the supply chain. What do I mean by that? I mean the supply chain for components and services. We have to ramp this up. The supply chain for people. Jazz earlier talked about people being a critical part of any company. The assets that matter in all companies now go up and down in the lift. We have to think about how we grow that supply chain of people, even going back to education and DFE. I'd be rebranding the DFE, the supply chain for people, if it was me. And it's the how that is the absolute killer now. We are constrained by physicality. We're constrained by how many people, how many tons of steel, where do you put it? That's the challenge. And scaling up that supply chain is something we've been through before. And for those of you who are involved in the submarine industry, in the mid-90s when we started rebuilding submarines again, we had to ramp up that supply chain to make sure that when the work started, the system was ready. But we have to crank through progressively. The gigawatt scale that we can do now, we have to push as hard as we can. And that's obviously Hinkley, obviously Sizewell, but Wilbur as well. We then have to really ram home the SMRs, particularly UK SMR, which is indigenous geniusness, Pincher Boris sort of phrase. It's ours, it's here, and it needs real push. But in due course, we might need a second one, because I think we need to have plurality of supply. There's an eggs in baskets issue, as we'll come on to in a minute, which we have to avoid. But also, if it's bulk hydrogen that's going to be the answer for replacing the natural gas through those gas pipes, through which about a third of our energy is currently delivered, if that's hydrogen, I'm as certain as I'm sitting here, that high quality nuclear heat will probably be the way of making the lowest cost hydrogen in the long run. But you can't do it all that way. There is no silver bullet in any of this. And actually, just coming back to my word system earlier on, there are very few systems on this earth that aren't balanced in some way. And in terms of our ability to get to replacing all that primary energy delivery, it's going to be a balance of nuclear and renewables and steam reform methane for making hydrogen. Just remember, though, that low carbon primary energy only comes from these sources: wind, solar, nuclear, hydro, and hydrogen from steam reform methane. That's it. That's where all the energy comes from. And anything else you want to use to ship it around, like ammonia perhaps, is derived from primary energy. And it's how we, how we build that primary energy supply that matters, whilst avoiding an eggs in basket risk, like dependence on Russian gas, for example. But meanwhile, we are no longer at the front of the queue in this. A decade ago, the UK was at the front of the nuclear renaissance. We're not any longer, and we are competing globally for all sorts of things. We're competing in different places, not just the UK, Canada, Europe, for example, Poland, Czech Republic, Ukraine, Estonia, Netherlands, all places, along with Romania and so on, that now recognise that nuclear is a critical part of the answer. The USA has suddenly woken up. And for those of you who are involved with the US market, you'll see what's going on and the way that the US national labs are now being supportive with the versatile test reactor, with the work of the TerraPower guys in Wyoming, with NuScale out in Utah. There's a whole raft of work going on there. And this is only just the beginning of the real ramp up, because it's now that net zero is really grabbing attention and people are starting to think about how. As I said, what's the global competition for? And we're competing for people and skills. I was on the board of Horizon, and as we were ramping that up, people came back willingly from Abu Dhabi on those huge tax-free salaries to be part of the projects in the UK. They wanted to be here, but they want to be everywhere now. There are lots of places where they can work, lots of places where those skills are in demand, and those nuclear specialist headhunters are going to have a wonderful business for the next few years. The supply chain for components. As we ramp that up, there will be shortages. Safety and regulatory skills take a long time to learn, a long time to build, a long time to polish. Those are in demand. And just back to finance, the impact of that low cost of capital and the amount of money needed means that we are going to be competing with everybody else for the finance. So there's important global competition to think about. But I want now to move around to the last bit, and I want to talk about markets, because markets have been immensely powerful in the energy system for a long time. I'm not sure that works quite in the same way. Just think about it. Low carbon energy, all of it, apart from blue hydrogen, is zero marginal cost. So what sort of market works effectively like that? Can you imagine going to the food markets and finding that all your vegetables from all the suppliers was zero cost, what would you do? Markets also historically have been a really good way of providing some sort of forward cost discovery. You know, you build 5 or 6 different versions of CCGTs, you find out which one's cheaper and you build more of those. It's a Darwinian process. You don't have time for that. We have to build everything that we know now, flat out. That's not a market. Electricity market reform from a decade ago needs a rebuild because the markets that are there now just will not work going forwards and don't make sense. And around all this, behavioural economics and what people do is important. So questions have to be asked about how prescriptive the country, the state needs to be. And should we treat people's access to energy, which is, I would argue, a basic human right, on some sort of competitive market basis? Well, brave, isn't it? Be careful about this. And I'd just like to think about all these ideas of having clever IoT stuff behind the meter. Demand side response, turning off big industry. Well, demand side response is another way of saying supply side failure, and relying on people's behavior to turn down demand just seems to me a beautiful example of saying actually we failed at our primary job. So there's some big market issues here to deal with. So questions like what sort of market will serve us best? What market actually produces low risks to the national economy, to the voters, to the citizens? And actually where we've walked into is limits to markets, real limits to markets. Markets still are great in certain areas, but not necessarily a universal solution. There's an L in PLC for a reason. I can tell you that if you want to see limits to markets, as a member of the Horizon Board, I also chaired the Risk and Audit Committee, and signing off a set of accounts where we wrote off £2 billion, that really brings it home that there really are limits to markets. So my final point is, what are we going to do about all this? How do we manage all these risks? And it seems to me that given the pace and scale of what we have to do, we need a guiding mind and some systems thinking at the heart of all this, which isn't saying that government has to do everything, but they have to make sure it's properly thought through. So we have to take all our tech and build it in a sensible system plan as fast as possible. And that means working backwards and how do we ramp up all the supply. There is no time for Darwinian evolution, and we have to remember at the end of the day that the state owns failure in nationally significant infrastructure. And if they didn't believe it already, I suspect the Secretary of State for Bays and the Prime Minister now, given what's going on, are beginning to realise just where we are and just what a challenge we have. But at that point, I'll shut up and get back to Jazz and any questions that you might have from what I've said. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that. That's been a whistle-stop tour of where we are in terms of having to try to bring nuclear assets back online and as soon as possible. So I suppose the question comes that we know we need to build within this community that we're talking to. We know we have to build quickly nuclear assets. Fission, tried and tested technology, we have that now. Fusion is on the horizon, but let's just stick to fission. What is from a Western world perspective, the single barrier, if you like, the strongest barrier for just saying, come on, let's just build a nuclear power station tomorrow? And it sounds very naive in terms of its questioning, but what stops it? Because if you look at the Reuters report today, where they're broadcasting that China's from 2000 to 2020 have built 48 reactors, why can't we emulate that?
There's no reason at all. It's about leadership and drive. It's about recognizing actually the outcome that we're trying to achieve and then working out how to get there. And we've come from decades of the idea that government can make things happen by publishing white papers and then markets just responding to the tweaky little changes. But this is a massive scale challenge, and it's about, first of all, the trust and confidence from governments to say, yes, we need to do this, and once we've started, we intend to go flat out. It's secondly still about a bit of a public reaction to the N word, and public support is fine, but it's really interesting. What I've elsewhere been talking about is you've got to get past what these words mean and look at the fundamental science. And if I do a completely different analogy, nitroglycerin, it's the safe cracker's explosive of choice. It also makes dynamite. But when you go into hospital with angina, that's what they give you to cure the angina. The science can be used in lots of different ways, and we need to get past that and recognize that the nuclear physics behind fission and fusion is one of the most powerful ways ever of creating energy in terms of use of land, in terms of use of natural resources. It is just the cracker. And the killer right now is, first of all, recognizing that we have to do it as part. We have to replace best part of 250 to 300 gigawatts of total energy capacity, primary energy capacity. And even if we did the 40 gigawatts that the NIA talked about in the 40 by 50 report, that's 40 out of 250 to 300. The demand is going to be still somewhere around the same. You can't assume that we're in a world that needs less than 200 gigawatts. But even then, it's still a bit of it. We need that recognition that this has to be done, firstly, that secondly, properly financed and built as a fleet. The cost of primary energy from nuclear is cheap. They can be built on time and on budget. The South Koreans, the Chinese have done it over and over and over again. The 48 you talked about, really good example. We've done it in wind, we've done it in solar. We've put fleet build into action, and we've driven costs down, and we've made it work. We have to do that with nuclear. And it is now the fundamental issue for the politicians, for everybody, is about trust and confidence that this has to happen. We can do it, and it's being honest about the need and the way we have to do it.
Thank you for that, Tim. Next question is, there seems to be a bit of a dash for hydrogen. Hydrogen is the panacea to all our problems, it seems to be at the moment. But to generate hydrogen, as we know, we need a lot of energy to be produced, to generate. You go through the electrolysis process. I can't help feeling that there seems to be some tension between the renewables lobby pushing hard on for hydrogen generation and calling itself green, whereas we in the nuclear industry seem to be lumbered with that tag of nuclear hydrogen being generated by nuclear power is pink.
That's
the
ridiculous.
First question is, does that label matter? And how can we get ourselves hydrogen generating, nuclear being used to generate hydrogen being classified as green rather than pink?
So
does colour matter?
Yeah, colour does matter, and it matters because it's actually distortionary. What matters actually really is the honesty about, is it low carbon or not? And if it's low carbon or not, it frankly doesn't matter what colour you call it. But let's be honest about low carbon. And just before I go on to the detail of the hydrogen stuff, part of the almost fentanyl-like addiction to interconnectors and bringing electricity in from Europe is because when it comes down that wire and it comes into the UK, it is technically classed as low carbon because the carbon involved in generating electricity is accounted for abroad. It's a scam. It's an off-balance sheet scam. We are not being honest about the true carbon consequences, the climate change consequences of the way that we generate our primary energy. So when we come to hydrogen, let's just for a minute assume that the idea that you can replace all the natural gas down the gas pipes with hydrogen will work. Let's assume that, because we don't want that sort of conversation here. But then, how do you make it? The amount of hydrogen that you need to make is vast, and at least it will need steam reform methane for part of that. It's a transitional process. But ultimately, you can make the hydrogen from other primary energy very efficiently. You can do it electrolytically, but the higher the temperature that electrolysis runs at, whether it's the proton exchange membranes or better still some of the solid oxide cells, as you get to higher temperatures, those of you who did thermodynamics know perfectly well that the efficiency increases. But you don't have to do it electrolytically. Once you get to advanced reactors running at 500 or 8 to 900 degrees, there are different thermochemical processes. So at 550-ish, the U-battery type example, the copper chlorine catalytic process produces hydrogen oxygen from steam. Go a bit higher to the high temperature gas reactors, like the one that they have in Japan, where you're 850, 900, and sulfur iodine works. I've made a bet with my kids that by the time our grandchildren are my age, the hydrogen, if we're using it, a lot of it will be coming from nuclear, either the heat directly or the heat to help electrolysis, just in terms of balancing it all out, because that'll be the most efficient way to do it. These taxonomical games and the labels that are applied to different forms of primary energy production are great marketing gadgets to offend people, but frankly we need to get past that, all of us. We must not be talking about preferences for one or the other. The right answer is a balanced system that's the right solution for a national economy at that level. That's the lowest cost of national economy. And we need to get past these silly, childish colouring exercises with pastel crayons. Doesn't help.
Well, I hope the bet is won because it is very important, and let's not underestimate the significance of that bet either. I've got another question for our risk and safety community. Risk and safety, all the work we do does end up influencing design. So now we come into the new build program. We have regulatory challenges from a regulator trying to ensure that our industry is maintained in a safe manner, which is important. We cannot afford another nuclear accident. That would probably not be a good idea right now. Yes, we are building new nuclear assets around the world, but do you see, is there something that the risk and safety community need to take into consideration in terms of polishing the design, dare I say it, or being overzealous in perhaps polishing the design that we need to start thinking about and try to make it a bit more proportionate? Because the sooner we get the technology out there, the better it is for the environment. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, Jazz, I do. The issue of risk and safety is something which the public find hard to understand. You know, if we were all rational about our understanding and our management of risk in our own lives, we'd fly everywhere. We'd never drive in a car. We certainly wouldn't walk down the street. But we don't think like that. And part of what I would love to see the risk and safety community do is to talk a bit more to the media about what this actually means in practice. And it's a hard conversation to have. When I worked in Whitehall, we looked pretty hard at how we could talk to the public differently about the risks involved in different forms of energy. And it is a challenge. It's probably about storytelling. It's not about just yet more facts. There's no point me sitting here saying, you know, deaths per terawatt hour from nuclear are a lot less than from rooftop solar because the safety standards are much higher. That doesn't work. It's the dialogue that we need to develop between the risk and safety community and the media to help the public understand. And in terms of ultimate risk, there is always this great tendency to make it just that little bit safer. And I completely understand that, but I'd love to see an honest conversation about LNT. There's some work being done by a biologist in South Australia at Flinders University, looking at the effects of low-level radiation on health, and a lady called Pam Sykes, and she's just retired, and she's looked at the health effect of low-level radiation really from a medical perspective. But on the way past, she looked at the health effect of low-level radiation on submarine maintenance workers, nuclear submarine maintenance workers, and diesel submarine maintenance workers. And before you tell me diesel's dirty and carcinogenic, as we know that, but she controlled for that with looking at cathedral diesels in ships and trucks and so on. And Pam's quite clear that there are clearly some positive health effects from low-level radiation. And she has two things that she says. First one, she said, 500,000 years ago, the world was much more radioactive. And all the species that evolved through that might have developed some form of protective mechanism to deal with low-level radiation. And as a result, she now describes radiation as being a bit like water. A lot of it is really bad for you because you drown. None of it's bad for you because you die of thirst. And a little bit is all right. And it's really interesting as you look around the world, the evidence, the real evidence of health effects of low-level radiation are pretty stark. Like, it's pretty hard to find anything honest. So wearing my nuclear risk insurer's hat with the new safety convention from Paris in 2004, liability is now passed to operators for 30 years for any exposure off-site, not triggered, not above a certain level, but just completely open. And that's really silly because we're not being honest about the world in which we live and the risks that we run in terms of climate change. You know, the risks from climate change massively bury any of the risks that we normally deal with in our safety and risk work in nuclear. And it's how we have that conversation rationally with the public. Because when it comes to driving the risks right down to nothing, I'd just say, just because you can doesn't mean you should. We need an honest conversation about it.
Very good point. Perhaps just finishing on that thought about how we communicate risk and safety to the public at large, perhaps things are changing because the whole pandemic, there was a lot of talk about risk, all the graphs that you saw in the public speeches and so on and so forth that were given by the experts. Perhaps the public is becoming more risk aware and beginning to understand the language of risk. So maybe the timing is opportune for us to go and from a nuclear community to go and talk about risk and safety and what it actually means. So perhaps people will begin to understand that.
Yeah, and Jazz, if I can just come back on
yes,
that.
Of course.
If you look at the public opinion surveys in Germany now, for a little while, there's been a majority of the population, not a huge majority, but certainly a majority, who want nuclear back again. And it's really interesting when you look at the details, those in favour tend to be under 35 and over 60. And not my language, a friend of mine said, oh, it's the middle-aged hippies who don't like it. But actually it is about an honest conversation about how do we get there, because if you look at what's happened in Germany, lots of renewables in there, all which has helped, but it's not actually helped in terms of driving the carbon down, because the balancing energy comes from lignite. And when you look at the carbon intensity of Germany, as you saw on that graph earlier on, that plot earlier on, it's jolly high. And we need to be honest and stop pretending that we can wish our problems away. We can't. This is about real hard physical science, engineering and practicality.
Very good point. So you'd be pleased to know the questions are coming in thick and fast. I'm not sure if I'm going to get through all these in the next 5 minutes, but I'm going to give it a go. So next one's quite an interesting one. Do you think, I'm going to rephrase this, battery storage, is it up to the job, or is it the Achilles heel of nuclear power generation? Because you can build loads of battery farms, generate using renewables, store that energy.
Yes, of course.
Job done.
Yeah, well,
Surely.
storage is important. Of course it's important. It's all part of balancing the system out. And, of course, if Edison had won the argument rather than Westinghouse, we'd have a very different problem, because frequency stability does mean that unless you've got a massive great grid and massive ability to deal with spare capacity to balance the system out, there are always going to be points where pinch points on the grid need support. So batteries are always going to be useful. Of course they are. Storage is going to be useful. But the weather in the UK and Western Europe in the early part of the year is really quite interesting, because what we tend to get is, first of all, it does often, not always, but it's often really cold. And when it's really cold, that tends to be correlated with a big fat anticyclone sitting over the North Sea, the UK and Western Europe when the wind doesn't blow. So if we just run a little thought experiment and imagine we go for all renewables backed up by storage, you've got to run the UK, the entire energy system of the UK, for probably a couple of weeks, 10 days quite commonly, off storage. Why would you build a storage system to do that when you need it once a year? How about having something that's balanced out, where you don't need to replace much of the intermittency with storage? Some of it clearly has to be balanced in, but how about balancing it out? In most walks of life, if you do anything to excess, it tends to come back and bite you. So storage is really important. It's really important for all sorts of transport reasons. It's important for stability, for backup. But as the heart of a big energy system at a national level, I cannot imagine how that could be economically remotely sensible to do. But it's vital as part of a balanced system.
Thank you for that. I'm going to wrap up a few questions into one thought. So it's all about government and government behaviours. Given the collapse of the Horizon project, which was a shame for the industry, it's put us back a bit, do you think the government has learnt the lessons from that project in terms of how to, if you like, encourage institutional investors to actually invest in these projects? Because if we don't get institutional investors in our current way that we would like to finance nuclear power, whether you agree with that or not, then it's going to be down to the government. So if the government has got the appetite fully to invest, we need institutional investors. So is the government in the mood to make it easier for institutional investors to stump up the cash to invest in nuclear projects?
Right, well, the quick answer to that question is tune into the Chancellor on the 27th of October in the autumn statement, because in there we will see just what he intends to do and how much he intends to support nuclear, Sizewell, UK SMR, but the big question mark now is, will he support Wilver moving forward? Government has an inescapable duty, one that they cannot outsource, and that is to make sure that nationally significant infrastructure is built, maintained and operated. It absolutely does not mean that the government has to build it. It doesn't mean the government has to pay for it, but they have to enable it to happen. And they have to work backwards from what could you do to build a nuclear power station quickly and efficiently in the way that the South Koreans and the Chinese have done, and other countries too. I mean, Abu Dhabi was not bad. And that comes down to de-risking that early process. It means making sure that by the time an organisation gets to that final investment decision, whoever it is, that the government have supported them as effectively as they can to get there with a very low risk of delivery. Because from an investor's point of view, particularly the first of a kind in country, there's lots of uncertainty. And what you have to do is to try and drive that right down, because all that happens if you don't have the risks of construction, of engineering, of planning nailed down to low levels, is that the financing community says, ooh, that's a bit dangerous, so I want an extra return for me being exposed to that sort of risk. Well, let's just turn that round. The consequences, going back to David Newbury's graph, of a bit higher return for the financiers is that electricity price goes up. The cost of that uncertainty produces a higher cost of electricity, which is effectively a tax on energy prices. So it's incumbent on governments to do what they can to support, not to pay for necessarily, but to support in rational ways that can help, to drive down the risk, to drive up the certainty, and to get to a fleet build process as fast as we can. And it's blindingly obvious that with SMRs, once you've built a couple of them and you can see the mechanistic process that is just turning a handle, you know, the idea of a small modular power station is just gold dust. We need to get to a point where we can crank these things out like shelling peas. And when you're doing that, the cost of capital comes down as well, because the perceived risk comes down and the investors come to the UK. But it's about that management of risk and the management of the process. It's how government ensures that a rationally sensible process to get to final investment decision is undertaken. And the idea that developers should be allowed to come along and invest speculative money is barking mad, because all that does again is produce too high a value of the cost of energy. You need to keep that cost down, and that means how does government enable the system to get to a point where it can build reliably on time and on budget, and just do it over and over and over again to build that 40 or 50 or 60 or 80 gigawatts of nuclear that we need to have. And if we don't get it right, somebody else will. And the Chinese are absolutely going flat out and will continue to go flat out. I suspect we will see a big resurgence in the US. We had the Illinois state reverse the phasing out of reactors there. So the penny's dropping, and we have to compete by providing that trust and confidence to the investment community more broadly, not just the financial guys, but the constructors, the contractors, the entire supply chain, and the people at large, the voters.
Excellent. We are 3 minutes over schedule according to my time clock here, but I have to ask you one burning question. We talked about submarines. Did you see the BBC drama Vigil? And the question around that is, was it good, bad, or ugly as far as the communication piece is concerned for the civil nuclear power industry, leaving defense aside?
Yeah,
Quick answer, please.
Yeah, I thought, a bit like Chernobyl, it was great entertainment, fantastic stuff to watch on a Sunday night. But I think the artistic license might have expired.
Thank you very much for that, Tim. That's been awesome and a great discussion. I hope everyone's enjoyed it online.